Hello, and welcome to Saving People, Queering Things, a supernatural podcast. We were previously known as Driver Picks the Podcast, and the episode you're about to listen to was recorded under that name. Though our name has changed as of season 3, our show hasn't changed that much. Our structure and theme-based discussions are the same, and we're so glad you're here. Now, let's get on the road. Hello, and welcome to Driver Picks the Podcast, the show where we talk about ghosts, road trips, and free will through every episode of the TV series Supernatural. Today, we will be discussing Season 1, Episode 13, Route 666, through the theme of humility. I am Abigail, your host, and joining me today is Renny. Hello. And it's now time for our series recap, the road so far in Season 1. We are more than halfway through this season, which is very exciting. So thus far in Season 1, Sam and Dean Winchester are on the road saving people and hunting things while they look for their father and while they try to find out who killed both their mother and Sam's girlfriend, Jessica. They have been so far unsuccessful in finding John, and Sam has been haunted by the dreams he's having about his girlfriend's death. In episode 9, they returned to their childhood home to hunt a spirit, but they still came no closer to finding John, even though John showed up in the town and did not come into any contact with the boys. In episode 11, Sam and Dean parted ways because of a disagreement about looking for John, but Sam returned shortly thereafter, and they are continuing to search, albeit to no success yet. In episode 12, Sam puts out another plea to John to show up when Dean is in serious mortal danger, but John continues to be evasive. And that brings us to this episode, episode 13, Route 666, and to our 30-second recap. Okay, Renny, you ready?
Yeah.
On your marks, get set, go.
All right, so Dean's ex calls, who he told the big family secret to a while ago, which is a big deal. They get there and they only have eyes for each other. Their chemistry is insane, but we've never heard of her. Sam has a lot of knowing looks and bugs Dean a lot about it. There's a racist ghost truck killing black men that did the same thing back in the 60s, and nothing was ever done about it. And so the boys figure out that it's a murdering asshole and have to kill his ghost, and they do, barely, using a method they never use again that could easily have killed Dean. And then...
Oh! You can finish your sentence.
It's okay.
Okay,
I'll be cut off. It's fine. Ready?
Mm-hmm.
3, 2, 1, go.
So in classic Dean fashion, he covers up his feelings a lot in this episode when they return to a town in Mississippi to help a girl that he was in love with years before. And they are able to stop this racist ghost that was killing people back in the 60s. And then when they end up leaving town, Dean gives a really sad goodbye to Cassie and covers up his emotions with his classic style of ignoring them, and also sunglasses.
Well done.
It is now time for us to discuss this episode through our chosen theme. And this week our theme is humility,
which we thought was perfect for this episode because there's a lot about humility between Cassie and Dean, and also with the plotline of the racism that's happening both now and in the past.
Yeah, what do you want to start with? Before we start, we want to give a brief content warning. We're going to be having some frank discussions about racism in this episode as per some of the themes and events of this episode. So be aware of that as we go into this.
Okay, I guess we can start chronologically, which is just near the beginning of the episode. Cassie's bugging the mayor about how she's noticing the pattern that these black men are dying in mysterious ways, and he's ignoring the fact that they're black, and so she's bugging him about that, and he gets mad at her and very defensive. And it struck me that, we always talk about the opposite of humility being pride, and I think actually part of that is the opposite of humility is defensiveness. When you're not comfortable in like who you are in your position, and so you are defensive of it. And he's very defensive. He's like, I'm the last person you should call racist, which is problematic.
Yeah.
And in doing what he's doing, he's not being anti-racist. He's perpetuating the problem because he's ignoring the very blatant, obvious part of the issue that all the men getting killed are Black.
Yeah, there's a kind of, and this happens not only with him, but also with a couple other characters in this episode, where Cassie particularly brings up the fact that, and also I think there's also another Black character that brings up the fact that these attacks have been very targeted against Black people. And in both of those scenarios, the white person in that conversation gets very unwilling to acknowledge the racism and to have any, like, there's this seems to be this like willingness to acknowledge that racism happened in the past, but this unwillingness to acknowledge that it could be happening in the present.
Yes.
Which,
we're all better now.
Yeah, to be like, oh, it's not the 60s anymore. Like, we don't have this problem anymore in this town. You know, we're a close-knit town. Like, you know, things are good. It can't possibly be racism. And like, yeah, exactly what you said. Like that defensiveness keeps them from actually looking at things for as they truly are.
And therefore dealing with the racism that is happening.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, you know, really blatant even in the fact that like Cassie, this young Black woman, is being ignored, is not being listened to. Like, she is obviously incredibly intelligent, has done her research, is bringing all this information.
She's a reporter. She knows what she's doing.
Yeah, and she's being dismissed and sort of like, you know, almost patted on the head and like kind of told, oh, you know, you don't know what's going on. Yeah, and I think like that's something that is maybe not being seen as like overtly racist, but is having an impact on Cassie's ability to do her job and Cassie's ability to get answers, and is preventing, like you said, preventing them from actually investigating
and solving the case.
A legitimate pattern that is happening here.
Yeah.
Like, they're so defensive about like being like, it can't possibly be racism, that they're not able to kind of go, if it is racism, like if this is what's happening, if there's a pattern, we should pay attention to it.
Yeah. There's also a point later where I noticed that Dean was humbled by when Cassie's mom is telling them what happened back in the 60s. Dean says, why didn't he call the cops? And she just gives him this look, and immediately Dean, like, you can see on his face the humility moment, learning about the reality of the systemic racism that they were facing at that time, and that they're still facing now. But he, you know, overall in the episode is pretty aware, I think, and you know, he takes Cassie seriously, and he's listening, and Sam too. Like, they're doing their job properly and using all the clues, but he did miss that piece. And I thought that was interesting from an audience perspective. The writers are kind of teaching a little bit, I think. Yeah.
Because they take both Sam and Dean take it seriously. They see the pattern, and I think partly because that's what their job always is to look for those patterns. And so they see the pattern of race that's happening here, and they don't ignore it, which gives them the ability to then see the racism for what it actually is, and to attribute what's happening to racism. Like the whole reason this whole situation is happening is because of racism. Yeah. And like to that point of when Dean asks, you know, why didn't they call the cops? And you like, you know, there's this ignorance that's coming from him being a white man who like generally could rely on the cops to protect him. But I also found that interesting because like they, in their line of work, most like they can't actually rely on the cops. But he still, because of his race, is able to forget that. To forget and to be like, well, you know, the reasonable thing would be to call the cops if you were in that situation. And you know, he gets humbled to recognize that wasn't the reality, and still isn't the reality, because like in the 60s it wasn't the reality that calling the cops would have been a good thing for those people. And in the current reality, when Cassie's gone to the cops and been like, there's a pattern, they've also ignored her. So this, you know, the only reason they're able to stop this ghost is because they actually believe the pattern that they're seeing,
Mm-hmm.
and are humble enough to like.
So they're able to connect it to the case in the past and realize that it's the same person, the ghost of the same person, and deal with it accordingly. Yeah,
and I think this episode is doing a decent job of that.
Yeah, there might be things we're ignorant to as white people.
Yes, exactly. Like I've seen, I think that this episode is doing better than a lot of consideration, like a lot of these kinds of stories, especially for when it was made in 2005.
Yeah.
But obviously, as white viewers, there are things we could be missing, and also recognizing this could be an incredibly traumatizing kind of episode.
It is traumatizing.
I remember originally watching this episode.
Yeah.
And the previous 12 episodes, there are creepy moments, there are horror moments, there are jump scares. I think this is the first episode that I remember being genuinely disturbed, because this is not.
This guy was pure evil.
Yeah, this was these were violent, racist attacks.
Yeah, and he was a human. It wasn't a monster.
No, he didn't. Yeah, this wasn't. And he wasn't this isn't someone in some of the previous episodes where someone turned into an angry spirit after death because they were killed violently or because their spirit wasn't put to rest. He was an angry, violent person before he died, and then he was an angry, violent person as a spirit. Yeah. And
so angry and violent that he possessed his truck, which they talk about in the episode as being only the most powerful angry ghosts can even do that.
And we'll talk about this a little bit in our lore check, but we're not really going to see
that again,
that kind of possession again.
Yeah.
or very, very rarely in this show. This is a very powerful spirit, which anyway, we'll get to some of the continuity stuff with that later.
I will point out before we move on that this show does not deal with racism enough.
No. And doesn't always deal with it well.
And this is one of the very few episodes that actually acknowledges it as a relevant part of the lives that the boys lead, which it would be, if this was reality, racism would be in their line of work and relevant way more than it is in the show.
Way more. And and even just when you think about the percentage of characters of color in the show, it's sorely lacking. We've been lucky that we've seen a couple up to this point, but still a very small amount. We've had a couple,
and how sad is it that it's lucky?
Well, exactly. That's lucky's the wrong word. We've had a couple of meaningful side characters that have been people of color. But we're not going to see them enough, and even with some of those characters, we're not going to get them. They're not going to be the recurring characters. Very often.
Yeah. The amount of times that the cops help them when they don't really have much reason
or
to,
let them go when they should be held or suspicious of them. This, show is predicated on a society that privileges their white race.
So the other big humility theme is Dean and Cassie.
Yes.
And Abigail and I have talked at length about this episode because Cassie is very significant to us as full-time Supernatural watchers. She gets him to open up and be vulnerable in a way that hardly anyone in the rest of the show ever gets him to do. And he, you do not connect humility with the character of Dean Winchester, especially in season 1. He's very full of bravado and trying to put on a front of, strong heterosexual male.
He's convinced he's right about most things.
Yeah.
Unless he's proven wrong.
He's very what's the word? Kind of cliche, testosterone driven, just kind of that very toxic masculinity kind of thing. But with Cassie, the way that Jensen plays this episode is so nuanced and interesting. She humbles him in a huge way, and there's so many moments of that throughout the episode.
And we get the impression that that's been the case
their whole
relationship, that when they met, and so they met back when she was in college. So we're based on the timeline of the show, they met in the past 4 years, but it's been a couple of years. I don't know if we have an exact timeline for that, but he was in his early 20s. and they had a relationship, and we get the impression that, I think what's interesting about it is that, you know, again, he plays up this bravado with girls of like, mostly it's just like physical attraction. But with Cassie, there's very clearly a significant emotional component to their relationship. And I noticed even in the first few scenes with them together, the physical distance that he puts between the two of them until they've actually had a conversation, that an emotionally vulnerable, like humble, honest conversation, and then you almost can't physically separate them in any scenes. They are like always sitting or standing or physically contacting each other. But that only happens after they've had that moment of humility with each other, where I think they both kind of have to admit that they were wrong about the way their relationship ended. And, you know, Cassie has to admit that she was wrong because she didn't believe him and just dumped him. And Dean has to admit that, like, the way that he is related to her and like the way that, you know, that I think that his bravado and that his like anger and his frustration gets in the way of him emotionally connecting with people. And Jensen does so much on his face in terms of their early interactions. Like, there are just so many moments where he is showing this like internal struggle between like vulnerability and honesty and like defensiveness, or between like he has a very blank sort of face the first few conversations they have, because I think he's trying to hold back the significant emotions that he still feels about Cassie.
We were talking about how this episode and the previous one, you pointed out when we were watching it that we learn so much about Dean through Faith and this episode. And the thing that strikes me about that is just that he has very deep feelings, but he's scared of them.
Yes.
Because of his trauma. And so only a select few people can get him to be honest and humble and vulnerable about what he's really feeling. Cassie's one of them. Sam's one of them.
Sam
even
is
though
going
in this,
to be more one of them.
In season 1, he's not as much. Dean doesn't really trust
because
him
of again the trauma
and the separation they've had.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me that he's been apart from Cassie for a few years and immediately still is comfortable with her and trusts her.
As soon as they have that conversation, as soon as they have that like honest, humble conversation, then he is able to be emotionally vulnerable, and we're going to see that with him consistently. I think in the few relationships in the show where he is vulnerable, is that it comes when people are honest with him and when he's able to be honest about his feelings. And like you said, these two, Faith and this episode, are like a bit of a Dean thesis, I think, in a lot of ways, for like where he's at. They deal with his relationship with John, his relationship with Sam, his relationship with like death, and his own like feelings about his own life and about what, you know, like I think one of the things that makes me the most sad at the end of this episode is like when he's saying goodbye to Cassie, and when and also the scene after they have sex when they're talking about, you know, and he says, you know, I'm still really involved with my dad, and
he's sad about
it. Like there's this sort of like what the word I'm looking for is just this sort of like resignation about his life of like, this is just sort of like the life I have, and I don't really get another choice. I, you know, have to hunt with my dad. I have to say goodbye to people that I care about. I can't actually set down roots. And that's even contrasted in, I think, you know, Sam is starting to grasp that that's why Dean is so angry, and that's why Dean is resistant, and that's why Dean doesn't show his emotions. I think Sam is starting to understand that it's because Dean doesn't feel like he has any choice in his own life, and that he's stuck in this life he doesn't really want. But even Sam kind of, I think, forgets that, because like Sam even at the end says, you know, does this situation ever make you wonder if it's worth it putting your life on hold? And I found that really interesting, because like Dean's not putting his life on hold. Sam still, I think, has a bit of an idea of like, this is temporary. This is not going to be my whole life. And I don't think Dean, since he was a child, has ever thought that. And when we're going to get, like, we're really lucky in this show, not in season 1, but we're well, actually, yeah, there's one episode in season 1 that's going to have a significant flashback to their childhood, but throughout the show, we're going to get flashbacks to their childhood and even flashbacks to their teenage years and the conversations Sam and Dean are having about what the rest of their life is going to look like. Like, I don't think Dean has ever really thought he was not going to be in this life forever.
Yeah. Yeah, and he grieves that, I think. But Cassie, he talks about the future with her.
Yeah.
And that's like, so
even
far,
when they say goodbye,
she's the only person that he's done that with, and he rarely does it ever again.
No.
He can imagine a future with her, and that is a big deal for his vulnerability and humility, I think.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, and I was thinking a lot about like the humility of like truth telling, and like that's so prominent in their relationship, and in a couple of the conversations he has with Sam, of like Sam can see how Dean feels about Cassie. Sam can read it, and Sam calls him on it, like very lovingly, very supportively, is like, I can tell that you're still in love with her. I can tell you it's not just about sex for you. I can tell you really care. I can tell that I figured out just based on what you didn't tell me that you didn't dump her, she dumped you, and you loved her. Like Sam like has that, but he comes at it very humbly. He's not like trying to make Dean, he's not trying to like bully Dean into admitting it. He's just sort of like, this is the truth and I can see it.
Good point.
I was thinking about that humility of truth telling, and like the truth telling of like who you are, about what your life is, about what your life is, and about what you want. Because like Dean and Cassie both end up admitting that they didn't want to break up, that the only reason they did was because they didn't understand the other person, and that they were too proud and too scared to like make it work, or to really communicate. And I love seeing that kind of unravel with them, of like they actually get to a point where they're able to say goodbye, being really honest about what they want. Like Dean saying, you know, maybe it's not forever goodbye, and her saying, well, I don't necessarily see a future, but they still definitely both want it.
I also, with the last kind of main point I had with humility is just that I think Cassie as a character has a beautiful balance of humility and pride, and like the perfect amount of both. She knows who she is and what she deserves. She fights for justice and truth telling, like you're saying, but she's not arrogant, and she knows how to ask for help.
Because she does call, even though they had such like what's alluded to as such a bad breakup, like, you know, Dean says, you know, I think you said I was nuts, and like clearly he's really hurt by it. And she, when she talks about it, she talks really emotionally and gets really vulnerable and raw about like being like, I thought you wanted to break up with me, but you just didn't like have the guts to tell me, and so that's why I broke it off with you. And where was I going with that? Just that like, yeah, she knows who she is, and she's honest enough to be like, despite the fact that they had such a bad breakup, she calls him when she needs help.
She asks for help.
She has the humility to be like, I still don't know if I believe you about everything you do, but I need help, and no one else is listening to me, and maybe even though I didn't believe you, maybe you will believe me. And she knows him well enough, I think, to know that he was going to believe her, which
I think she believes in his love for her, which is pretty cool, because he doesn't have love for many people.
He doesn't express it when he does often.
Exactly.
And he obviously expressed it enough in their relationship that she is confident in it, even after several years.
I wrote, Dean's love gets the job done in this episode.
He really does.
Because he takes her seriously and listens to her when nobody else does, and that's the thing that makes it happen. And when she's in danger, he fights hard. He fights her mom, and he makes her to get the truth. Because he's not letting anyone hurt her.
Which is really, really lovely.
Yeah.
The one other thing, which is not specifically tied to humility, but we are going to want to talk about it. And so there's going to be a couple of spoilers in this next little section for season 5, 6, or actually, no, sorry, season 3, 5, and 6. So if you don't want to be spoiled for that,
skip the next 2 minutes.
2 minutes. So Go ahead.
Okay. This kind of ties into this segment of plot points that they drop.
Yeah.
Because Cassie never comes back. And this is a point of anger for me. Because
yes,
I
and
think,
me.
yeah, I think she's an incredible character. I love what she does for Dean and who she is as a person. I think they could have totally developed her, like, her
and they
depth
left the door
and
open enough that they
nuance.
could have
Yeah, totally. They left the door open. They literally left them saying, I hope we see each other more.
And she doesn't even get mentioned. She gets mentioned one time in season 4, just very briefly and not significantly. It's not like an update on her. It's just like a reference back to this episode.
Yeah. He's clearly in love with her. I can't believe they never referenced that again. He doesn't really end up in love with anyone else other than Lisa, who, so Abigail and I have edit to make in the Supernatural series Zeitgeist writing, which is that Lisa's character should have been Cassie, because she is who he wants to settle down with. She's the person that he's in love with. He wants to risk leaving the only thing he knows and build a different kind of life for himself, one that he's always dreamed of, and it's very vulnerable and humble of him to go to her. She has a kid who could, you know, if it was Cassie, it could have been his kid from this episode.
And
theoretically.
And Lisa is portrayed to us when we meet her as like a one night or a 1 week stand, basically. Like Lisa is not someone
a weekend, I think.
Lisa is someone he had an incredible weekend with, but honestly they portray it as like mostly like he had a fun, sexy weekend.
He says some joke about how she's a yoga instructor or something like that.
It's you know, it's very much his machismo, like but Cassie he had a real emotional connection with, and so I think there would have been so much they could have done if Cassie had been in that place, if Dean had a kid with Cassie that he didn't know about, that he then meets in season 4 or 5, like 3. I think it's season 3 where we meet Lisa. If there had been, you know, a toddler and he'd been like tracking it back and being like, oh, is that my kid? And, you know, would have made the events of season 5, the end of season 5, so much more meaningful.
So much
if
more.
If he'd been able to go back and like, you know, have even the internal conflict of season 6, when he's unsure of whether or not he's going to be able to maintain the relationship with Lisa and go back to hunting after we find Sam. Obviously, if you don't know, season 5 and 6 is not going to make any sense, but if you do, then you'll understand what we're referring to. But like, it would have been so much more emotionally resonant with Cassie, because they had a chemistry that, like, unfortunately, him and Lisa I do not think have that chemistry. Like, we love lovely Lisa as a character,
really important character.
Don't think that she was able, the way they characterized her, she was able to fill the emotional role that she needed for that storyline to really work. And I think Cassie would have been.
It would have made so much more sense for him to be so deeply torn between hunting and a quote normal life, if it was Cassie. And
we
also,
already know he's emotionally torn about that.
We can also say, for any Destiel people out there, Cassie, the two loves of his life. It just makes so much sense.
It's just such a great mirror, like the emotional connection that he has with Cassie, and then the emotional connection that he has with Cass. It just is funny that the two of the most emotionally honest, vulnerable relationships he has have basically the same name. Well, and Castiel gets jokingly called Cassie by a number of other people in the show, which is just fun.
Well, and they're also the two relationships that are pretty much like taken from him by the writing.
Yes.
And you know, the best parts of Dean are his vulnerable sides and the fact that he is scared of them. Like, that nuance is so relatable and so interesting, and it's part of why I love him. But they robbed him of that in the writing, which, you know, I love the show, but wish they had done that differently.
They done dirty with this. And I just forever sad about Cassie never returning.
It was a big I think a big like opportunity lost.
Anyway. And I don't know if there was a specific reason for that, or like if that's an acting reason, or if that's just my guess is that it's just honestly they just
different writers,
different writers, and forgot about her and never pulled back. Anyway, that's
spoilers over.
Back to we're gonna move into our going meta segment. We're gonna kind of fly through this because we've already talked quite a bit about this. First off, significant deaths. Oh yeah, so in our going meta section, we talk about the lore, we track a few different elements of the show. We talk about pop culture. We talk about some theory. It's real fun. First off, significant deaths.
There are none.
Yeah, there are none. Second off, the Bechdel test. Does this episode pass?
We were torn about this because there's one scene where Cassie and her mom are talking and her mom's telling the story about what happened in the 60s, but we decided that it did not pass the Bechdel test because she's talking to the boys mostly and about men.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
there are two, the closest they get in this episode is the fact that there are two well-characterized female characters that get a lot of screen time, and they get the most amount of screen time of anyone other than the boy in this episode, which is something, but it's unfortunate that even with that, they still don't pass the Bechdel test. Yeah. They could have given those two a scene without Sam and Dean. That probably would have been meaningful and would have given us more connection. Like when I think of this episode, I mostly think about Cassie. Not that I forget about her mom, but I forget about her mom's significance, and her mom has such a tragic story. And
it's the whole key to the entire episode.
Yeah, and I wish we'd gotten it.
And that woman was an incredible actress. Like, it would have been cool to see a scene between Cassie and her mom and just solidify that relationship a little bit more.
Yeah. Especially since they get this huge revelation about Cassie's dad's their history, and we don't really get to see how they figure that out as a mother and daughter. Yeah, which is unfortunate. Next is our lore check. So we talked a bit about some of the continuity stuff. They try to do a normal salt and burn with the body, and it doesn't work, which is not that uncommon, honestly. No. Spirits are often end up being tied to something other than the body. That's gonna be pretty consistent.
Pretty par for the course.
However, the whole possessing of a huge truck is not very common.
No, it doesn't happen again. And also, the way they get rid of it, how a spirit can't pass over hallowed ground, that never comes up again. I feel like they could have used that so many times.
I feel maybe it's too easy. Contradict that because I think there are a couple times where there are spirits legitimately in churches.
I think you're right.
So I think they just directly contradict that. It's a super interesting thing of saying, oh, spirits can't pass over hallowed ground. But yeah, that definitely doesn't. They don't remember that.
I don't think they ever reference it again.
Just too bad because it could have been a cool thing to.
Yeah, but it also is a little easy. It does. Spirits in churches is an interesting thing, so it makes sense that they threw it out.
Yeah,
a lot of stuff in season 1 is like that, I think.
Yeah. The other thing we wanted to say here,
car chases.
Yeah.
There's a big car chase in this episode. It's kind of the climax, and we were just talking about how there aren't really very many car chases in Supernatural, which is funny because the car is a main character.
Yeah. The other thing we found just really funny was Sam and how they actually managed to trick the truck into passing over the church, which is how they get rid of it. We just had a good laugh because this is going to become a thing with Sam, where he is very intelligent, comes up with a very interesting new idea for how to take care of something. Because when Dean leaves with the car, Dean's like, burn the truck. And Sam's like, I could burn the truck. I could try to burn the truck, or I could come up with this batshit crazy plan that might work. And if it doesn't work,
my brother's dead.
My brother's 100% dead. And so he gets Dean to lure the truck into driving straight at him. And two funny things about that is, one, Dean goes along with it, which shows the incredible amount of trust he has in Sam, which is not surprising. And B, it's just really funny because this is going to become a pattern with Sam. And
talking about humility, Sam has no humility in that moment. He literally even says that he didn't consider the fact that he could have been wrong.
Yeah, because Dean's like, what if it didn't work? And Sam's like, hadn't thought of it. Yeah. And then Dean's like, Dean has a moment in the car being like, that's cool. That's great.
Yeah.
Glad that I
could have died
right there, which we just thought was funny. Next is locations. This episode takes place in Mississippi. I've never been to Mississippi. Have you been to Mississippi?
No.
I haven't been to the South. And there's not really anything distinct in the filming locations of this episode. It's mostly filmed in Richmond. There's a couple filming locations they reuse from previous episodes. So the mental hospital that they filmed at for Much of Asylum, they also film outside of it in this episode. But most of it happens in kind of random locations. Next is pop culture. So any pop culture references, anything interesting there?
I don't think they do.
There's not
Their
really.
alias in this episode is just a family friend of Cassie's.
But then also, yeah, it's true.
But then I think they use a different alias with
Insurance.
Oh yeah, insurance people with
Yeah.
the guys that they're talking to, like on the docks.
Which didn't make any sense to me because this is clearly a small town. So using multiple aliases seems like a really good way of getting people
Suspicious.
really
of who
suspicious.
you are.
And again, they're, you know, young, attractive white dudes. They managed to get away with asking very invasive questions of the people around them.
Yep. Anyway,
and gaydar, which
this episode doesn't have a lot of
of queer stuff
in it.
But I think bears noting that like it does challenge the like kind of heteronormative like you know, relationships are mostly about attraction, like physical attraction sort of idea, because Dean's been sort of characterized up to this point as like someone who makes jokes about like attractive girls. But the reason that him and Cassie work is very clearly because of their emotional connection. Like, yes, they have sex in this episode. Yes, that's like clearly they are physically attracted to each other, but they're also like very emotionally close. And I think that's like the show already challenging. It's, you know, I think it's highlighting that the show is going to have Dean present this particular kind of masculinity and relationship to people in a sexual way, while actually not usually playing that out in the way you would expect. Like it's, you know, mostly an act. That's interesting.
This lays the groundwork for some future things.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
We appreciate that
very much.
So we have one more segment, and today that segment is blessings. So who would you like to bless in this episode?
Yes. I would like to bless Cassie.
Oh, surprise. Good. I'm glad you're blessing Cassie.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about her, but I just think she's a great character. She has so many layers for a guest character, you know, a guest actor. She has so much nuance and depth and like strength. And you know, she's really hurt in this episode. Her dad dies and she almost dies and her mama almost dies and nobody's listening to her.
And then she finds out this like horrific family history that she's got to now reckon with.
Yeah, and she's going through some shit. And you know, seeing her ex that she was in love with and having to say goodbye to him again, like I don't know, she deserves a big blessing. And so I am blessing Cassie today.
I hope that she, despite, I mean, it's probably better for her that she never runs into the Winchesters again, honestly.
Yeah.
You know,
she found a great guy and settled down and
had a good life.
And, you know, a successful career in reporting, because she's clearly very good at
it. Oh yes. Well, gonna break with my tradition. So far, I've blessed people 3 times. It's been Sam every single time. But this episode, I'm going to bless Dean because. Yes.
I was hoping you would.
And you were gonna, I was like, perfect, you're gonna bless Cassie, I'm gonna bless Dean.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's been through the ringer the last few episodes. He's had some revelations about the way Sam's anger is often directed at him. He's had Sam leave and come back. He's still had John not show up. He's almost died and had John not show up. Like, I think he's starting to realize some of the abandonment in John's relationship in ways that I don't think he has allowed himself to feel before this point. And then in this episode, he really gets to be vulnerable, and like it shows his softer side and shows that he could want a life outside of hunting if he actually felt like it was an option. And I think, you know, I want to bless him for having the courage to have him show that, and to show it in front of Sam too, where he like, you know, as much as he doesn't talk to Sam about Cassie a whole lot in this episode, he lets Sam talk, and he lets Sam show his approval, and he like, you know, is close and emotionally vulnerable with Cassie in front of Sam. Like, he is letting Sam see him in a way that Sam hasn't seen him before. And I think that, you know, at this point, considering their kind of contentious ground of their relationship is like, I think we're solidifying that like we've started the show with, you know, in a lot of ways, Dean's primary loyalty is to like John and to like whatever John says, and that's shifting back into, I think, what they had as a child, where Dean's primary loyalty has always been Sam. And I think we're seeing that now that with the things they've been through, and I like seeing that. So bless Dean for like leaning into that vulnerability.
Yes, which is very hard for him to do.
Very hard. Very
so
hard. I love when
we're proud of him.
Yes, we're very proud of him. Thanks for joining me, Renny.
Thanks for having me.
So fun. We got to record in person today too, which this is the second episode in a row we've gotten to record in person, which is very exciting.
Yeah, and my first one.
Yeah, exactly. It's very fun. And to anyone listening, we wish you a peaceful road till we meet again. Thank you for coming along for the ride. Next week, we will be discussing season 1, episode 14, Nightmare, through the theme of zeal. A note to our listeners. This episode was recorded prior to our season 3 name change, where we went from Driver Picks the Podcast to Saving People, Queering Things. For all of our new social media platforms, visit queeringthingspodcast.com.